Welcome to Low Effort Poetry School, where you can watch bad videos about how to write good poems. My name is Catherine, and I'm a poet too. Alright, so today I decided to do something a little bit different, which is from start to finish, write a poem. I'm going to do this on camera by sharing my screen, and I actually wrote the poem already, and I'm recording this voiceover afterwards. So I'm going to go through everything that goes into writing a poem in my process. At least for this poem, this is what it took. And so I started with the prompt Sunday morning cartoons. One thing I want to note is that this is going to be in real time, and I'm cutting out a couple of spots where I just basically sit there not typing. Like I got a phone call, I had to take the dogs out, but pretty much everything else is just that's why this video is so long. Like you're gonna see the whole process. And maybe you think that's so boring and not interesting at all. But if you want to get into the nitty gritty of how something goes from like literally nothing to a poem that's done, this is one poet's process for pulling open the curtain. I also want to add that I didn't know what this poem was going to be when I started it, and I can't vouch for it for being like the best poem I've ever written, but it's pretty good. Like looking back on what I've done, it's a poem. It's a poem that I wrote, and so I think when I started recording it, obviously I had no conception about what it was going to be other than it might be related to the prompt Sunday morning cartoons. And you can see how right now in the video I'm just kind of like circling around the concept of like Sunday morning cartoons, and I'm thinking about nostalgia, and I'm thinking about splat, fling, bounce. Like, what are physical things that might be related? And trying to find ways that I personally could relate to a Sunday morning cartoon beyond just the fact that I'm of the age when Sunday morning cartoons were on TV when I was a child. So you'll also see that I have writing scraps that go nowhere and don't come into the poem later. And knowing where to discard is also really important because if you'll see, if everything that I wrote in this first document, poem notes, went into the poem, it would be a terrible poem. So right now I'm talking about a meme that's going on Twitter. It's something about what's a piece of lore about yourself, and people have been quote tweeting it and using that as an opportunity to like talk about a factoid from their own life in the guise of in the framework rather of like this is a piece of lore. And I was trying to sort of badly explain how that was like maybe that there's something there. And here I have just hit on an idea that is what is my nostalgia trying to sell me? So I'm trying to now answer the question that I have posed, what is my nostalgia trying to sell me? And you can see that I'm still kind of spiraling outward from the prompt. And I'm still trying to figure out what this poem is, um, because Sunday morning cartoons isn't a poem. Like, you basically have to, in my opinion, when writing a poem, it's really helpful to have a couple of ideas. Like a really good prompt would be Sunday morning cartoons plus something else, and that would be a much easier way to find what that poem is. So that could be sometimes a form. So I could have had the prompt to be Sunday morning cartoons plus a sestina. And then there's a path to writing a sestina and finding what that poem is from there. That prompt could have been Sunday morning cartoons plus my mother. And then you can triangulate if you have two points of reference much easier than you can with just a single pointed prompt. So in this next little piece of writing, I have started having images, thoughts. I'm getting a little bit more abstract, like with the concept of stasis and nostalgia, and seeing if those things gel together. Um, the and at this point, I'm not writing a poem. I'm also have meta thoughts about the poem just right there in the document. So I say maybe the poem wants to be flipped from a different perspective. So it's really easy to kind of get lost in this very early stage. And so I think it's helpful to just write down all the thoughts that I'm having, including the ones that obviously won't make it into the poem. Because one thing is, sometimes those thoughts do make it into the poem, and that can be weird and interesting. But more often, they're just a guidepost to help me figure out how to find out what the poem is. Now I'm going to be drilling down into a specific memory that I have about this secret magic diary toy. Um, and there's a process of zooming in and zooming out that happens in this stage of writing a poem. So it's all in the serving the purpose of finding out what's sticky, per se, and then entering the poem, finding an entry point for the poem. And so with this memory, I would call that a zoomed in um, attempt. Um, I'm also trying different points of view. So sometimes when you write about nostalgia, you write from a place of being a child, but you could also write from a point of being a nostalgic person as an adult. And so it's not really clear at this point in the process what my point of view is, what I'm trying to say with the poem. This is all just exploration. And as I said previously, not all of this is going to be what the poem eventually becomes. Though I will go back and sort through for some of the more interesting phrasings, some of the more interesting concepts once I have figured out what the poem is going to be. Another thing that you might notice is I start repeating myself um, in parts of this process. So I have said, I walk into a nostalgia store. What do I want to purchase? And then I start coming back to and do variations on that. So I have just written, I walk into the nostalgia store and try to buy the childhood I wish I had. And I'm doing this because I like the idea, or there's something interesting about it, and I'm trying to figure out what's interesting about it, and I'm now circling closer to what the poem is. At this point, I've kind of made a decision where I go, okay, so maybe the poem is about the nostalgia store. The next step after that, and you can see me doing this right now, is just describe the nostalgia store. And I immediately went to this dream that I had about it's a recurring dream that I have about a little boutique store. Like sometimes it's a convenience store, sometimes it's another kind of store in a precarious, unrealistic situation like the top of a mountain or an island in remote part of an ocean. Um, and so I just go, I don't know what this means yet, but I'm going to throw it in there and see what see what happens, because that's an image that I have kind of ready to go. From here, I basically have the idea that the stuff that I'm going to be writing is not necessarily all of it's going to be in the poem, but I'm no longer searching for what is this poem about. Right now, this poem is about a concept called the nostalgia store. Um, and I'm still not totally sure, like, what does it mean? But I've got the image that's going to be carrying me through the poem, and I'm kind of off to the races in terms of searching for images and searching for meaning. A fair amount is still quite redundant. Um, So at first, I'm talking about the nostalgia store is at the top of a mountain and it's hard to get to, but once you get there, you feel safe. And then I come up with the word perched at the top of the mountain, or then I pivot to maybe it's actually on an island and the sea levels are rising. So in both cases, there's a level of precarity, but uh, ultimately when I choose this the island image, what I'm going for there is this idea that there's a submersion that's related to memory in a way that falling doesn't resonate, but being submerged does. And that's not necessarily conscious at this point, but it's like half conscious. It's basically just seeing what resonates and going from there. Sometimes in a poem, when I'm composing, what you kind of get into a rhythm of like there's this repetition, and then you want to think about how can you disrupt the repetition in meaningful ways. And one of the tricks is just to say, all right, if you've been saying this is what something is, this is how it works, you can just throw a little teeny tiny curveball and say, well, what's one way that it doesn't work? And so that's what I'm doing here. I write, you can't buy a super soaker at the nostalgia store. You can only buy the feeling that not having a super soaker used to give you. When that ad came on, when you wanted one most. And I'm highlighting this, and I don't normally highlight in my process, but sometimes I do. And the reason that I'm doing it now is because I know I'm being recorded, so that I'm drawing attention to that line, because basically, it's a line that is going to be important in some way. I'm highlighting it because I'm like, well, this isn't necessarily going to be a beginning line or an end line, but it might be a turn of some kind. Like that's a that's a meaty line or a meaty idea. And I don't want to forget this and not bring this over to the next document where I put the poem together, which is funny because that's exactly what I do later, as you will see, because I have highlighted it. It's now like somehow invisible to me, and I ignore it, and I have to rescue that line at the very end. So it didn't work what I was trying to do here, but it's all fine because it's not too late. So next I'm talking about what I'm asking questions and answering them. And then so I write, what is the currency at the nostalgia store? And the intention of writing what is the currency at the nostalgia store is not that that is a line that will go in the poem, but it is a meta question that I want to be figuring out. And so then I just go and answer it in a way that, once fiddled with, might be a line in the poem. So here I know that I like the idea of talking about currency at a store that is the nostalgia store, but I also know that I have not figured out exactly how I want to put that. And so I'm just writing down different options for the line, knowing that I don't want to lose my momentum because right now I'm getting the bulk of all of the lines written and I'm not in editing mode yet. And those options are more of an editing mode tweak that I would be making later on in the process. I'm also, when I'm writing lines now, I'm trying to be both non judgmental, but also kind of keeping my ears perked up for anything that might be stand out or better than the brainstorm average. So I'm looking for lines that will make it into the poem, lines that might be first lines that would be a good entry point into the poem, and particularly last lines, because a last line usually isn't the like last thing that I think of. To write a good last line is hard, and I usually find that I have come up with one about 2/3 through um, the writing of this part of the process. So once I get up ahead of steam, somewhere in there is a line that I will move around later in the process and end it that way. One of the reasons to be as non judgmental as possible at this part in the process is because judgment leads to editing, which leads to slowing down the process of actually writing. And it's really hard to edit something that you don't have any words to edit, if that makes sense. Sometimes you can see in this process, like it's not totally just fluid, never going back, but I try not to get hung up on figuring out which words are the perfect words. I just want to get like, what is this line? What am I trying to say? And I don't have to say it perfectly in the first go, which is why I usually do this process digitally and not in a notebook. But I mean, sometimes you're on the go and you don't have your phone or what have you, and you don't have your laptop, and a notebook for this part of the process can definitely work. And some people do work that way. I'm also trying to be aware at this point which are the cliches that are useful and subvertible, and which are the cliches that I can fix by changing a word. Like I'm looking at uh, it aches in the back of your throat like a good cry, and that's just riddled with cliche. But it's also okay at this point in the process because this is not the final poem. And I would challenge anyone, no matter how expert of a writer, to be at this point in the process and not have a couple cliches that are being utilized. You'll notice that I am writing without line breaks at this point, but in more like little fragments of stanza or like fragments of paragraph. It's like almost you could put bullet points next to these, and it's more like that. So sometimes I will write and do this process all in one big paragraph and then break them down into this sort of bullet pointed thought. It's rare that a poem will make it to final poem form um, without a remixing. And this is just writing it in this way as a helpful reminder not to let it just stay in the order that it came out, because it doesn't look like a poem right now. It looks like thought fragments and brainstorming. Good for you if you've made it this far into the video. I am not super sure how useful this will be for other people, because I'm just one poet and this is my method of writing. But I thought that for at least some people who write poetry or want to write poetry, seeing a polished poem at the end is cool, but how many times have I wondered, like, okay, what did this look like at 10% of written, at 50% of written? And so I thought I would just throw this out here in a big, long, maybe boring video, but hopefully there will be utility for at least some people. Sometimes at a certain point in the brainstorming process, I'll have to deal with voice and choosing the what person the poem is going to be in, and I will have made choices kind of subconsciously, and I have my own like verbal tics when I write. And so oftentimes I'll put something in the second person just because I'm used to writing in the second person. And then I'll want to go back and say, okay, is this really a poem that deserves to be in the second person? Is there a reason that it wants to be this way? So you see me scrolling back and going like, okay, what have I actually how have I written this already? What do I have here? How hard would it be to change? And the answer to that is like usually not that hard. You just go through and make the changes. But there's a level of wanting to ascertain what are the inclinations of the poem already doing, and is there a reason why that should be honored, or is there a reason why I should change that? And this is a really good point in the process to do that. As I continue to draft, I try to use repetition to get myself going. And I'm also, because this is poetry, okay with writing in fragments. So I know that I can start a sentence, the nostalgia store, and then kind of let momentum take me through to the end of whatever thought that is without having to have like a brilliant idea as I start to write. That's one of the benefits of free writing. And this isn't exactly free writing, but this is in the neighborhood of free writing for sure. Non-judgmentally and openly just trying to get words onto the page. I also sometimes go back and elaborate. Um, so there, I just added the word plastic into the plastic box inside of the stuffed reindeer toy that I'm talking about from my childhood. I don't know if you had one of those. Okay, farming engagement. Leave a comment with one of your favorite nostalgic toys from childhood. And I'll be very grateful to have that information helping my algorithm. Thank you. All right, back to writing this poem. Yeah, so I get the sense, like, as I'm writing, I'm getting the sense that I've written most of what I want, like, most of the meat already exists of the poem. And so soon I'm going to be remixing it and editing down the things that don't belong and extracting the things that do belong. I've highlighted another space, another line, rather, that is what becomes the end of the poem. And at this point, I have a good idea that is, I've highlighted it because it's a candidate for how to end the poem. And this one, I don't get lost in the mix, like I got the other highlighted line lost in the mix. Even though I have written what I at that time believe is going to be my last line, I don't stop drafting at this point. I keep going because I still have a little bit of momentum and I want to just see what other images I can get that will be usable for the final poem. You can also see that at this point in the process, the things that I'm writing are much more likely to be quote unquote poetic because I've had half an hour of writing and I'm all warmed up at this point. So the lines that I'm writing tend to be a little more of a leap and there's a little bit less like matter of factness and that can be really useful to have both kinds of writing in a poem depending on what your style is, what your voice is. So what I'm doing now is opening up a separate text edit document. I'm naming it Poem Draft, and I'm just going to be copying the lines that are going to go into the poem from the poem notes document. So I don't like to erase anything that's going on in the poem notes. I think that it's best as an additive process rather than a subtractive process. So I start over with a new document and I just copy and paste over the things that sound like the poem. And this process is when I start really for the first time going back and reading everything that I have and making choices about, okay, what is the tone really going to be here? Because there's still a lot that can change in the discovery of the poem. And so here I'm selecting kind of the first section that's going to get edited way down. And there's still a part of this process that's figuring out what is the journey that the poem is going to be taking you on. So at this point, I don't know what the beginning line is going to be. I'm just saying, okay, well, am I on a mountain or am I on an island? Well, I guess we're going to switch this from mountain just to island. And one of the interesting things about poetry is if I didn't want to pick, I wouldn't have to pick um, between mountain and island. I would just have to do a little bit of work to make the contradiction make sense and have a reason for a contradiction in the poem. Like maybe the nostalgia store moves around, but I'd want to have a reason for the nostalgia store to move around. Poem logic is definitely a thing. Okay, so I'm scrolling around looking for the next thing I'm going to bring over. Another way that you can do this is really just to copy and paste. Oh, here I am going like, I've already copied that section over. And then I don't do that highlighting thing at all for the rest of it. Such big ideas and not enough follow through. At least the poem got written. So, like I was saying, the other way you could do this if you were going to follow this method of using more than one document is to just copy and paste the whole thing and then subtract the words that you don't want to have in the poem. That's probably what I should do. But this time, for whatever reason, I didn't do it that way. Which also means that I lost that first highlighted section, which I had to go and rescue at the end. At this point in the process is also when you start to get a sense of how long is this poem going to end up being. Because there are some times when I have poem notes that are many pages long, and the poem itself only is 50, 75 words because I'm very selective. Because sometimes it's because there's an awful lot of throat clearing that happens in the beginning of one of these documents, or I change the idea halfway through, and so half of the poem notes that I was using to find what is this poem about, that switched, and so there might be more than one poem in the poem notes, which is another reason to save your poem notes. And sometimes it's just like kind of an off day, and it's not a totally off day, but it's like kind of an off day, and so the percentage of what you have written, most of it isn't going to be that usable. But sometimes it's a pretty good day. And today was a pretty good day for that. And so now I have started editing and I'm making decisions about, okay, that's a cliche, an ocean sweeping in, the ocean tide sweeping in, and I'm trying to think of a different word. And you can see that it's stumping me. Creeps. I tried creeps. No, that's a word, but not the right word. There you go. Thinking about how about rush. Sometimes basic is better than the cliche. Not always the same thing. So the ocean rushes in. Frothy sea foam lapping at the bottom shelves. So while I have written and copied over a bunch of the words that are going to be the final words in the poem, This is also a point when I'm going to be adding more words uh, that I'm writing, composing um, from scratch. And that's what I'm doing here, carrying the jewel belly troll dolls out to sea. So I'm just elaborating on the line and the image of what gets carried out to sea when the ocean rushes into the nostalgia store. I'm also going to be moving things around. So I highlight the nostalgia store is a snare, and that's a sentence that I decide should be like a summing up sentence as opposed to an introductory sentence. So the line now goes, the nostalgia store has rooms in the back that get smaller as you go. Each room in the nostalgia store feels more sacred than the last, but isn't. The nostalgia store tightens like a snare. And I'm editing that, so what I just read is not the way it ends up in the poem. Um, but that's the basic idea. You, at this point in the process, are totally allowed. It's all about moving things around and making it sound the way you want it to. And a ton of my editing process really is just going to be spending time fiddling with the order that things go in. It is so rare. I just have to reiterate, so rare for the order that a poem, the lines in a poem are initially written. That is not the order they end up in. Even when I'm telling a linear story in a poem, like from a memory or something, it's so often that the lines don't end up in that order in the poem at the end. There's also a lot of fiddling with like tenses that happens at this point. So you want the poem to be consistent, and in the brainstorming process, in the first poem notes drafting process, I do not worry about things that like consistency of tense. Um, I generally wait until this section to make sure that tenses agree and basically grammatically it's doing what I want it to do. Also, this is not a poetic safe space for lines of poetry. Sometimes I'll decide, you know what? Nope, you're out of here. There's also the negotiation of removing ands and other filler words. I tend to have poetry that sounds a fair amount like natural speech. That's what I'm aiming for, at least. So I might have more ands and thans and just filler words to make it sound natural, but I'm still trying to elevate the language, and I don't want filler words where they really don't need to be there. So this is a process where I'm tightening things up as well. Here's where I decide that this is going to be the first line of the poem. Ah, ta-da! And at least I'm trying it out. And then I go, oh, well, if that's the first line of the poem, then nobody works at the nostalgia store is going to sound a little redundant to the ear. So I make that edit there. So it's funny how, even at this point in the process, it still doesn't really look like a poem. There's going to be a ta-da moment in a couple minutes where I put it in Garamond, and that's when I start to think of the poem as a poem. this is still sort of in a proto poem uh, idea in my head, even though the words are starting to be in the order that they're gonna be in the finished poem. So here I'm going, okay, well, I found the beginning of the poem, and now I'm going to move the end of the poem to the last line of the poem, and I'm going to see how it works. And I'm changing the tense. There's that second person that I gotta erase, move it back to the first person. Oftentimes, uh, people will, me included, will compose in the second person, because it's less personal. Um, it's easier to say hard things sometimes if you have that layer of linguistic distance between you and the thing that you're saying. Um, and so it's always worth asking the question, do I really need this to be in the second person? And sometimes the answer is yes. Sometimes the answer is no, I don't. And yeah, I went back to rescue another line that I had forgotten to do. This is really not the way to do this. I really should have just copied everything and then deleted things. Um, but it worked out fine in the end. So I'm working on the line, the only currency the nostalgia store accepts as payment is time. And I think, am I going to be deleting this? I'm kind of going like I went at the beginning. I said, okay, here's the first line, here's the last line, and then I go down to the second line and work through the poem that way. Sometimes it's a linear process, sometimes it's a less linear process, but I generally hit every part. Yep, there it goes. I'm like a good cry. I don't like that part. Oh, the ache. Do I like that? No. You can see I'm waffling. Like, is this a killing your darlings? Oh, I'm just trying with the good. Gonna take that out. I'm thinking about it. Oh, I'm trying to fix it. I'm trying to fix the good. Helpless cry. Like a helpless cry. Is that better? No. What does that mean, even? Um, like a jagged cry. That makes me think of Alanis Morissette. No, I don't like that either. Like a mournful cry. Like a melancholy cry. Uh, yeah, I guess. Did I leave it in like that? I hope I take it out. I'll be taking that line out in the future if I leave it. Okay, so I've moved on. Um, okay. So I'm looking at, oh, I have found a place for a comma. I'm doing little tweaks now. But yeah, there's a your cousin that I want to, yep, there it is, that I want to turn into a my cousin, because I don't want to pass off that small crime onto you. That's the thing I can own. Um, an M dash. Need that M dash. And I'm like, is this it? Am I happy? Oh, I have decided that the nostalgia store is the title of the poem, and the first line is always open. So now I'm starting to go, okay, what are the line breaks in this? And this is the first point. We're 45 minutes in, and I have not yet started until now thinking about what are the line breaks going to be. Sometimes with adding line breaks, it makes it easier to edit some of the text because you can see in a different way, like, oh, I don't need that line. Like, you're going to see extra words sometimes, or places where you can elaborate. Um, and it is just another opportunity to change and edit and grow. So I'm adding this line, never to be thought of again, which is kind of a cliche, um, but it's also kind of a joke. Like the way it's phrased, it's sort of funny. So maybe I'll give it a pass. I'm not sure I would write that again, but here we are. So here we are. I have still left in like a melancholy cry, and I'm just going through and saying, couplets, let's try with couplets. Um, and finding places where uh, the line breaks might add value. One of the things that I think about when finding a place where a line break might add value is if I have to break a phrase in two, what are the meanings of those phrases separately, and do they add anything to the initial meaning? They're also useful sometimes for having a change in direction. Um, so, a but I will find often comes right after a line break. Um, but I don't want to do that all the time because that's boring. So you can see that I just edited out the second time that I did that right in a row. There I'm just fixing the tenses to make the toys plural, and then adding those line breaks. I delete the map of, yeah, to make that more simple, because the map is implied from topography, and so I don't need it to be redundant. So I've gotten to the end of the couplets, but I didn't start making it couplets at the beginning, and so I'm like, well, this sort of works. And do I really want it to be couplets? Do I really want it to be these long lines? And so I go, okay, well, it's definitely a poem now, and I'm thinking about it in terms of a poem, but is this what I want it to be looking like at the end? And so now I'm going through just from beginning to end, or at least I'm starting there. And there I removed an and that was unnecessary. Um, I'm basically poking at the weaker words in the poem to see if they hold up. So I'm hovering the cursor over the only, am I going like, and I'm thinking about like, does that only really need to be there? Because sometimes the words like only and just don't really mean anything in the context. And so these are like trial efforts. And so now I've decided that I am readjusting the line length and just dove in there and said, there would be a good line break. And so I went for it. And then I go, okay, well, now am I going to do the rest of the poem? I'm a little bit ADHD when it comes to editing, but all is forgiven. I'm still doing word selection in some places. That was shelf goes to space. Um, as instead of rooms, I wanted to say space, which isn't as specific, but I didn't want to reuse rooms right back to back. I also don't love people. as there's some words that I just feel like I lean heavily on and I try to edit out. People, the word thing is another one that I don't love. Like something, it's just really easy to be general when it's better often to be specific. So here I'm taking out of who, which could probably have been of whom, and then I was like, I don't want to mess with that. It's fine to just say only ghosts you used to play with. You don't need those extra words. Um, and I also wanted to highlight the line break. There's regret, line break, at the nostalgia store. So that line break puts extra emphasis on the word regret. That's a heavy hitting word, and it's doing a lot of work at this point in the poem. I'd had. I had had. That's awkward. I don't know if I like that. Oh well. I'm getting closer to the end of this this once over of the poem. And then I will be putting it into Garamond, which is my own little ritual around saying, there's a draft. Am I going to do it? No, I'm still going back to the beginning. There. So at the beginning of this poem, it is self-serve. It's kind of a double. There's an entendre there. So I wanted to make that more apparent by deleting the word only at the end of that line. So you can see me kind of scrolling down. I'm going, all right, this is what this poem, the shape of this poem is coming out to be. I'm pretty comfortable with it, though I'm definitely not done with this poem. This poem isn't like the final draft yet, although it's getting relatively close to having a draft. So then what I do is I copy the whole poem from poem draft into, there we go. Nope, you got to highlight first. Yeah, this is little. I hope you can read this. I'll read it to you once it's done at the end. I'll read the whole poem. Another thing I like to do, and it's cut off at the top so you can't see, I am going down and turning off the grammar errors and the spelling errors, because at this point it's all going to be intentional, and the little like pointing you messed up lines underneath the words irritate me. So I want to see it as it would look on the page out in the world. At this point, I will be reading the poem out loud to myself to see how it sounds and if there are parts that could be improved, taken out, edited, what have you. So that's probably what I'm doing at this point in this video. That you can't hear, what I'm doing is reading the poem out loud. And so I've gotten, there's something I want to change, and I'm going to identify. I think even if you don't fancy yourself as a performance poet, which I guess I kind of do, and that's definitely how I started out, it really helps to read any poem out loud, because you start to notice things such as, I'm about to go, okay, there's two butts right back to back, and I don't want the butts right back to back drawing attention to themselves like that in the poem. So I go in, I fix it, no harm, no foul. I'm also going to change the order of words to a castle of wooden blocks on the floor. So now I have just had the horrible realization. I've gone through this whole process, and the first thing that I highlighted, oops, there it is, it didn't make it into the draft. So I go, well, it's not too late. I haven't recorded this audio yet. I can go back and where am I going to put it? And the way that I decide where to put it is relatively early in the poem, after I'm talking about what the poem, how the world works of the poem. And so I talk about time as payment, and the next thing, oh, gotta switch it to Garamond, it's being upgraded. Um, and then I wanted to talk about what you can't do in this world. And I thought that was like a refinement of the idea. So I wouldn't want to put that first because then you wouldn't understand what the poem, like, what is the nostalgia store. That's, you got to get that out there first. And you don't want that line to go at the end, because although it is a good line, it doesn't have the emotional resonance required to be at the end of this poem. We've gotten to basically the end, where I'm just making tiny adjustments in the words now. I'm reading it over and over again out loud, zeroing in on different sections that have little speed bumps, and these are small adjustments. Yeah, but although, oh, here it comes, I'm like, nope, that line, it's gotta go. Phew, saved by the bell. So this video is coming out to be about an hour long. In actuality, it took about maybe an hour and 10 minutes. I didn't cut very much downtime out of this video. This is, real time, pretty much the amount of time that it took to write this poem. So I'm just making the final adjustments, words here and there, and then I'm going to read you the poem as it is finished now. The nostalgia store is always open. Nobody works here. It is self-serve. The nostalgia store is an island. At high tide, the ocean rushes in, frothy sea foam lapping at the bottom shelves. Last week, it carried the jewel-belly troll dolls out to sea, never to be thought of again. The only currency the nostalgia store accepts as payment is time. You can't buy a super soaker at the nostalgia store. Only the feeling not having a super soaker used to give you when the ad came on and you wanted one most. The nostalgia store goes on forever, but the rooms in the back get smaller as you go. Each space feels more sacred than the last, but isn't. The nostalgia store tightens like a snare. There are no people at the nostalgia store, only ghosts you used to play with. There's regret at the nostalgia store, but don't call it that. No names for anything but plastic here. I walk into the nostalgia store trying to buy the childhood I wish I'd had. All I can find are flashing lights, greeting card melodies, stuffed reindeer playing carols from plastic boxes in their bellies, Legos, a Playmobil dog stolen from my cousin, Tamagotchi poops. the cracks on the backside of the school bus seat, a topography of childhood from a raven's eye, a castle of wooden blocks on the floor, the sound they made as I knocked it all down. So this ended up a long video. Let me know in the comments if you want more like this or more of something else. This was fun, actually. I had a good time making this video, and I hope you like it. And thanks for watching. See you later.